Now, I don't know when or where Mr. Dewar died. He may have died in Scotland, and I haven't yet done a lot of the research that I will have to do. So I don't know if he died in Scotland or if he came to South Africa. But certainly her mother and her two brothers and herself relocated to South Africa. And both of her brothers initially worked on the mines and then remained in South Africa. Margaret was a scholar at a very good school, Queen Street Girls' School in Edinburgh. And this suggests that she came from a family prosperous enough to invest in her daughter's education and not need to send her out to work. The school was quite grand. It was established in 1694 by a woman called Mary Erskine. She was a banking businesswoman in her own right, and she established the school for the daughter of Edinburgh burgesses, middle-class people such as were the Dewars. The school was, and it remains large, it's now co-ed, and obviously Margaret was very much a gentlewoman, and this was a requirement for her to be admitted into her later career as a nurse. She was educated in much the same way, I'm sorry about the rotten picture, as were the boys of public schools, because in Scotland, education for girls at this time was very much valued. After all, this is where Scottish women were allowed to attend university before they were in England. And they were allowed and accepted and registered as medical practitioners before they were in England. Margaret then moved on, and she trained as a nurse at the Western Infirmary in Glasgow. And this is the badge of the Westminster Infirmary School of Nursing, as you can see at the bottom, which no doubt the nurses wore on their uniforms with the Scottish thistle. The Western Infirmary was part of the University of Glasgow's teaching hospitals, and so the lecturers were very eminent people, many of whom went off to the war. It's quite interesting just to look at the nursing uniforms at the time she trained. The long aprons, the caps, the cuffs, and the collars. And the reason I mention those particularly is because in the list of Margaret's personal possessions, when they did the list of everything that had to be packed and sent back home to her mother in South Africa, there were lots and lots of cuffs and collars and caps and aprons and coveralls. Clearly, she spent her day in this not very practical uniform. She qualified once she'd been an enrolled nurse. She qualified and then she went off, obviously not alone. A number of nurses carried on to Dundee, the Royal Infirmary at Dundee, and this is where she, from 1905 to 1907, worked as a theatre nurse in ear, nose and throat diseases. Well, that's what she says in her application form. She then returned to the Westminster Infirmary, where she worked until 1911. But round about 1911, she came out to the Witwatersrand, and this is the East Rand, and the reason I put it is that this shows the 62 kilometers of the East Rand, and of particular interest is Knight's metallurgical plant. There was Knight's mine and there was Knight's metallurgical plant, and you'll see in the church records why it's of relevant. So Margaret's brothers, Jack and William Leslie, came out with their mother. We know that William and perhaps Jack was working in Knight's mine in Germiston. And we know this because he and his mother lived in the Knight's Deep cottages. I haven't been able to find yet the extent to which they still exist. But by 1911, Margaret herself was in South Africa. She says that she did surgical and private nursing from 1911 to 1913, and that she had the rank of a sister. And one of her references as a matron, you always had to give a matron's name, is a Miss Ritchie, whose address is in Germiston, which suggests that it's in Germiston that Margaret herself worked. And she also claimed, she added in, particularly at the end of the form, that she had nursed a good number of enteric fever cases when private nursing in South Africa. So I don't know if she thought that there would be a lot of enteric fever cases and they would be, something that would make her more desirable as a nurse. But here is St. Andrew's Presbyterian Church in Germiston. Mrs. Dewar and both her sons were members of the congregation, and the church has a book, which I found in attics, recording all those who were communicants in good standing in those days. Mainly Scots names of Scots origin, mainly mining addresses, but also very clearly local doctors and lawyers and teachers. So here we've got the book, and you'll see we've got the Thompsons, the Gilligans, and then we've got Mrs. William Dewar living at Knight's Deep with J. Dewar at Knight's Deep. So we know that at that stage they're a mining family on that mine. And you can see the Thompsons are at Simmer East, which is a mine. Simmer and Jack is a mine. Deep level cottages. So it's very much a mining community in those days. A later period, we've still got Mrs. Thompson, but the Dewars have gone. And at this stage, Mrs. Dewar had been living in Rose Street, and you can see it was Jack, and then it was corrected to be William, and he had been living at Knight's Deep, and then they had left. They'd obviously left the congregation and gone to live elsewhere. And in the correspondence that I've got from the War Office, you can see that Mrs. Dewar moved from time to time. And the War Office found it quite difficult to contact her in the very lengthy correspondence that was happening. Well, war broke out. And I know that William went off to war. I haven't yet had time to find out where he served and how he served, but we know he survived because his granddaughter Melanie is here today. But Margaret applied to be a member of the Queen Alexandra Imperial Military Nursing Service. She applied in July 1915, so she would already have been back in England at that stage. So here is the top of the application form. It's a bit difficult to read here, but let me just explain. I actually could not find Margaret's records in the Public Record Office at Kew in London. And it subsequently turned out that her file had been inserted into the file of somebody called Mary Marshall. And so she didn't exist in the records. Mary Marshall existed, and Margaret was filed under Marshall. And Mary Marshall and Margaret were killed in the same bombing by the same German plane. So it was just incredibly lucky that this was found. So you can see this is where I've got the information of Margaret's life, where she went to school, etc., etc. Now, this is the QA's uniform, and except that the skirts now end at the knees, or people wear trousers, the uniform is much the same. It is still grey with the red. This is the matron, the full cape and the bands, and this is a nurse, staff nurse or nursing sister. And they still have, as I say, the red and the grey. It's very striking. And in fact, the person who found Margaret's file for me in the PRO office at Kew was herself a QA nurse. Now, Margaret wasn't accepted as a QA nurse. They just took too long to get around to her. So tired of waiting for assignment, she joined something else, the Scottish Women's Hospital. Now, you might remember that some years ago I talked about something called the South African ambulance, which wasn't just a motor vehicle ambulance. It was actually an entire hospital. And similarly with the Scottish Women's Hospital, it was an entire nursing and medical service doing a lot of surgery and a lot of research, and in fact it operated hospitals all over Europe. And the story of the Scottish Women's Hospital is quite interesting. Dr. Elsie Ingalls was the founder of the SWH. She qualified as a surgeon in Edinburgh. Thereafter, she founded the Scottish Women's Suffrage Foundation, and she went on to set up hospital units during the war. When war broke out, she suggested to the War Office the creation of women's medical units on the Western Front. And she was told, my good lady, go home and sit still. Because, of course, one of the sticking points was that they wouldn't have women doctors in those days in the British Army hospitals for a very good reason. They would have to be given officer's rank. The rank would have to be that of captain. And that was very problematic. And the British Red Cross, for much the same reason, also turned her down. So Dr. Ingalls formed the SWH, and she dispatched women's units of doctors and nurses to the Western Front, to Serbia, to Malta, to Romania, and to Russia. And they served the governments of those countries, which governments were very pleased to have her services. She herself served in Serbia. She was captured by the Austrians. She was taken prisoner. Eventually, she was released and she worked in Russia, and she died in 1917. Now, this is a Scottish women's hospital unit going off, and it's leaving from Cardiff, and actually it's now this group in Sarajevo. Sorry, in Serbia. They funded themselves. They did a lot of fundraising, and you can see here it's Help Gallant Little Serbia. Serbia was very important, rather like gallant little Belgium. The smaller the country, the more the emotional attachment and the wickedness of the terrible Hun. And there was a lot of publicity associated with the fundraising. So here you can see, for instance, an ambulance, Scottish Women's Hospital, and it's the London unit. In other words, a London group had funded it. So there was a Girton unit funded by Girton College, Cambridge. The Americans funded the Scottish Women's Hospital, and you'll see time and again the names of various places, and you think, oh, they must be working in London. Well, they're not. Now, they leave for France, and this is the Edinburgh Evening News, and I know that Margaret's not in it because she's still in South Africa at this stage. But here they are in their very hot uniforms and being waved goodbye. And we have all the names, and I've actually never even read the names of all these people. I'm just checking. No, it doesn't have Margaret in it, but off they go to France. Their luggage sometimes goes to the Serbian unit in Russia, but in this case, Margaret, along with others, went to Royaumont Abbey, north of Paris. Now, the French and the Belgians didn't have the same tradition of professional nursing. After all, they had a much longer tradition of nuns in convents and abbeys performing this very necessary work. And so both countries, Belgium and France, were very delighted when Dr. Ingalls suggested to them that the SWH could work. And they said, absolutely yes. They offered her the facilities of this Abbey Royaumont, just north of Paris, and they would operate under the overarching control of the French Red Cross. Now, the soldiers who were treated at the Abbey were mainly French, some Senegalese and North Africans from the French colonial troops. Now, the Abbey is very beautiful, and I went to visit it last year for the first time, and there were all sorts of areas they wouldn't let me go because clearly I wasn't an important guest. But it's now used for art exhibitions and for musical events, and it really is quite lovely. And if you want to get a toasted cheese sandwich, it's going to cost you about €100. Now, the medieval grandeur was very impressive. But a book that I read last year about Royaumont, it was incredibly damp, dirty, there was no electricity, there was no running water, there was no heating. Its use as a hospital was absolutely horrifying. The nurses slept on the floor, they bathed in cans of cold water, and they did surgery. The doctors did surgery by candlelight. But over the years, it improved and improved. And it was here at Royaumont that Margaret first nursed in a theatre of war. There is mention of her in the SWH records, but I was very uncertain that this was the right MDUA, because she makes no mention of her time in her application to join the British services. And perhaps she didn't mention that she'd been with the SWH because she didn't want to blot her copybook when she applied to join the military nursing corps. And the very beautiful cloisters. Now, this is Dr. Frances Ivins. She could not obtain a commission as a doctor in the British Army, but by the end of the war, she had a formal appointment within the French military. And she and 6 other doctors, and you can see this is the Girton and Newnham unit Salonika, but with other doctors, she was awarded the Croix de Guerre. The team of nurses was composed of Scottish, English nurses, and Margaret, interestingly enough, counted herself as a South African, as you'll see from the autograph album. And yet she'd grown up in Scotland, she'd been to school there, she must have had a Scottish accent, but you'll note there is one particular mention of her being a South African. They wore not the QA uniform, but you can see they wore a rather sort of military outfit, which was the Scottish Women's Hospital. And here is Margaret, a rather beautiful young woman, and we don't know when the photograph was taken. Was it at the beginning or the end of her career? More of the Scottish Women's Hospital, and this time they are at Royamore. Now, the wounded came from the front line, which was not very far away. They arrived at a railway siding called Creel. They were collected by the Scottish Women's Hospital ambulances, and they were then driven 12 kilometres in these ambulances to Royamore. And you can see here, this is Royamore, where it doesn't look as though there's anything urgent going on. But again, you can see the advertising all the time. And here, this is in Salonika. It's not a French event. The kind of surgery, that theatre that none of us would like to be operated on now, but I'm sure if you were a soldier, you appreciated very much the heat, the ability to boil water and sterilize, and the fact that there was a group of people now with electric light dedicating themselves to you. The refectory, looking after patients. Somebody with a head or an ear wound. And when I was there, they were getting ready in what had been the refectory, as you can see, for a musical event. But this is how it was used in this painting. At the time, French soldiers in blue. And here they are posing. I don't think anybody looks too unhappy. They're obviously quite pleased to be immortalized forever. Here's the cloisters as they are today when I was there. And here's a painting of the cloisters in use. You can see the soldiers out of doors, and that is Dr. Francis Ivans. And the idea very much was that for treatment of gas gangrene, that is when wounds became so septic that gaseous gangrene developed, fresh air and sun would be very helpful. You remember at the South African ambulance at Caen in the south of France, there the idea was that seawater was very helpful, and also sun and fresh air. And here are patients actually out in the courtyard in the sun. The library today, and again in use at time of war. And you know, when one just looks at the red blankets, one of the reasons apparently for the red blankets was to make the hospitals cheerful. And if you think people who'd been living in the mud and the blood and the dirt and the tragedy and the soreness and the misery of the trenches, it must have been wonderful to have suddenly become a clean person, and suddenly to be in a cheerful bed, and suddenly have women around you, you know, being nice to you. It's a remarkable thing. Here is the last picture I've got of a ward at Royamore. The laundry. Imagine washing bandages. They couldn't throw them away. They had to keep washing them and hanging them out to dry and reusing them. And they did use French people from the local village. Here is the award by senior French officers of medals, and Dr. Ivans being present. And here, and this is my very best translation of the plaque I saw there, and if anybody speaks French better than me, please do not put your hand up and correct me. But it seems to be here from 1915 to 1919, Miss Frances Ivan, CBE, MS London, was the chief medical officer of the Scottish Woman Hospital established in the Abbey of Royaumont through the good graces of its owner, Mr. Edward Guin, and the generosity of British and Allied donations, and 20,861 wounded French soldiers received the most devoted, without limited devotion, of an exclusively feminine personnel. Okay? And here is a tapestry to much the same effect. Les Dames Écossaises, the war is 1915 to 1919, okay? 200 bed capacity. That says 10,861 patients. How many did I say? 20. Well, you see, my French is so wrong. Okay, Scottish Women's Hospital, they will shine in history. We've got the 2 doctors, and we've got the soldiers and soldiers with heads bowed. Okay. Now, while Margaret was at Royaumont, and this is how it was confirmed to me that she was there, was through her autograph album, because I wasn't absolutely certain from the record I have seen. So I have another nurse's, a Cape Town nurse's autograph album. She drowned when her hospital ship sank in the British Channel, Dorothea Bolus. Now, we know Margaret was in France because on the stamp, which I have not yet deciphered, you can see Abbé de Royaumont, France, 1916. And then MS Dewar, 1916. So she was at Royaumont. And here she's written the auxiliary hospital, Abbé de Royaumont. This is the Asnières-Sauzoise, Seine-et-Oise, France. And then on this side is the ward. So obviously they named one of the wards Jeanne d'Arc, Joan of Arc. And then another ward is named here Marguerite of Scotland, Queen Margaret of Scotland. Now, it's quite difficult to decipher this, but I'm happy to say that we have a former soldier who was a conscript, who's lived in France for many years, and being my youngest of many, many brothers, he is now in his perfect peasant-like French, going to read out what these grateful soldiers said to Margaret.
I've been bullied into this.
Mm-hmm.
So. Alors, le premier, c'est Amy Boyer. Je reconnais ça des soins que vous m'avez donnés et je garde de vous le meilleur souvenir. Which translates, are you translating?
I thought they'd like to read it and then I'll put the translation up.
Le deuxième, c'est Bataille Cyprien. Je vous remercie beaucoup de vos gardes et je garde de très bons souvenirs de vous. Et le troisième, c'est Gérard, départ quelqu'un. Nous meilleurs remercions pour les bons soins que vous m'avez donnés. Je garderai des bons souvenirs.
Well done. Unfortunately, I didn't live in France for many years, as did the youngest boy in the family, so this is my translation. Rather rough, but you can see it's quite difficult in an autograph album to put something novel and new all the time. So they said much the same thing. But we know that she remained in their hearts, which is rather nice. Anyway, in March 1916, Margaret now chased up the Queen Alexandra Imperial Nursing Service. She entered into a contract with them. She gave her address as Norfolk Square, Hyde Park, and she contracted to serve with the British forces. You can see I, Margaret Smith Dewar, of Norfolk Square, Hyde Park, London. And again, this would have been the uniform that she would now be wearing. She was sent to Brighton, which is mainly known for the Brighton Pavilion, but another building at the time was the Brighton Workhouse. And the Brighton Workhouse was turned into the Kitchener Hospital. And you can see there was an infirmary next to it, and it made sense. It was a town with a lot of large buildings. I don't know where they sent the inmates of the Brighton Workhouse, but they were obviously booted out, and the Brighton Workhouse became known as Kitchener Hospital. It mainly it mainly looked after Indian soldiers. And you might think that that is incredibly racist to have segregation, but actually, if you think about it, Hindus are vegetarian, Muslims don't eat pork, you need to have particular kinds of food, and do you know that they even did cremations? And in fact, the Brighton Cemetery, where Indians are buried, is very particularly in an Indian sort of way, the architecture and all the rest of it. So it was mainly Indian patients. Margaret does not seem to have been nursing Indian patients, and that is simply because, looking at her album, she doesn't seem to have had Indian patients. And this is all at Brighton. And these seem to be her patients. And to return to the album, perhaps the album demonstrates why she had left the Scottish Women's Hospital in Royamore. Now she could talk in English to her patients. Now there could be a rapport, there could be a bit of fun. Because the entries in the autograph album are sometimes maudlin, sometimes quite flirty, often cheeky but very complimentary, often complaining, and usually very grateful. And clearly she had some favourites, because she let them write in her album more than once. Some wrote about war, others about their wounds. Some recorded when and where they were wounded, which I find interesting, wanting to place your mark, wanting to be recorded somewhere. And others made absolutely no mention of the circumstances of their meeting, that they were wounded soldiers coming from war. Most of the entries are written in indelible pencil, very difficult to reproduce, quite hard to read. But I'm just doing an extract of some of these because I think it's important and interesting. It gives an idea of who were the soldiers, what their relationship might have been with nurses, where they came from, and we all know how difficult it is. I had an autograph album in primary school. It's very difficult to think of anything, and I'm sure they struggled as well. Anyway, the very first entry, which is quite difficult to read, is Tommy had a little wound by A. Reardon of the East Surreys, and he makes it clear that he was wounded at Hullach in March of 1916. Tommy had a little wound. His bandage looked so nice that everywhere in town he went, they let him in half price. The next person, Staff Sergeant Tucker, at Kitchener Hospital wrote, "Here you made me suffer grief and pain." Or Sergeant Crippen was far more artistic. He was from the West Kents, and he said, "Some sister." And you can see the QA's cape, which is what they wore every day. Then there was Arthur Ashton, and he described himself here as a Princess Pat. Now, Princess Pat was the daughter of the Duke of Connaught, who was Queen Victoria's son. The Duke of Connaught had been the Governor-General in Canada, Princess Pat was there, and the Canadian Light Infantry was named after the Princess Pat. So anyway, this man, Arthur Ashton, because wrote to her as though she was a South African, to our South African sister. So that's where I get the indication that she indicated that she was from elsewhere. And what we've got here is to our South Africa sister, one of the lands from the land of the maple leaf wishes Sister Dewar luck and happiness with her days. He also thanks her for her care and consideration to him while under her care, Canada. Then there was obviously the naughty group in the naughty corner, because they are called the Silent Four of 105 Ward. And I'm sure that meant the exact opposite. And they wrote, "There is a hospital not far away where we get the large amount of 5 cigarettes a day. And if we grumble, the head sister will say, 'Put them to bed and stop all their pay.'" Then Private George Horatio Knight of the East Surreys, he wrote, "She's got a smile that's full of guile, a pair of roguish eyes, a dimpled chin, a peach-white skin, an ankle trim and neat, and what is more, she's got a score of lovers at her feet. And though she's got no end of what is costly, chic and smart, I'll tell you what she hasn't got. She hasn't got a heart." Now, somebody called Cecil, and I honestly cannot work out his surname, but anyway, he wrote a poem on a much appreciated topic. "A bonny name is Dewar, there's Johnny of that ilk. His whiskey it is sure, sweeter than honey milk. But sweeter still another Dewar, who comes from o'er the Dee. My Red Cross nurse and sure, a braw fine lass is she. Her Christian name is Mary, and she's a winning smile, a foch that's light and airy as bonny Mary of Argyle. I guessed her name was Mary, but I guessed wrong, that's fines. She'll tell me not, but is contrary, so it spoilt my blooming rhymes. With pleasant recollections of my sojourn at the Grubber, very gratefully yours." So presumably Kitchener Hospital was also known as the Grubber. Then there was a wit called Private J. Richardson of the Yorkshire Regiment, and he placed a stamp in her album, you can see it's a stamp of George V, and wrote, "Here I am in Brighton, and here I mean to stick." In other words, don't send me back to the front line. Now, remember, this is 1916, and there has been the Easter Uprising in Dublin. And Private Burke of the Leinster Regiment in Limerick commented under his name, "some rebel." And I don't know to what extent that meant he was a Catholic or a Protestant or what, but he was from Ireland. And he wrote, "Little bits of shrapnel, little bits of shell. When a fellow stops them, he thinks he's gone to..." Exactly. But you can see there's that cheekiness, but that carefulness. So Margaret hasn't told the one soldier her name. He thinks it's Mary. You know, there's just a line that they don't quite cross. They don't write hell, just in case it's going to offend. You know, there's a bit of levity, there's a bit of being able to push boundaries, but at the end of the day, the nurses are very strictly controlled by their matrons, and there's this great discretion. Also, everybody here isn't an officer. You know, there are sergeants and privates. We've got, "Who is it comes a perfect pest at 6 a.m. to break my rest, disturbing me in my warm nest? The night sister. Who when I'm fretful and oppressed, speaking soothing words that gives me rest, who in God's sight will stand well blessed? The night sister. Who once again in war's loud blasts will sadly gaze into the past, who'll think of her until the last? The Tommy." And this is written by an earlier author, one of the favourites, I think, A. Reardon of the East Surreys. And I think it's absolutely true. Any of us who've been patients know, quite honestly, it's actually not the great surgeon who we think about. It's those wonderful nurses who keep us going. I speak as the granddaughter and the daughter of nurses, and I have 2 sisters-in-law of nurses, one who is here. Again from Reardon of the East Surreys, he's now taken to drawing pictures. And what he writes at the bottom is "no more kissing, 'cause you slobber." Now, I don't think he was referring to Margaret, he just knew how to draw babies. But then we've got Company Quartermaster Sergeant Cornstalk of the 9th Royal Unidentified Regiment, and he says, "I'm sending you a gift. This lucky black cat I am sending to you as a mascot to make all your wishes come true and to wish you long life, happiness, health, and prosperity." There are many, many more entries, but the last of the many entries in the album is from an unidentified BN of the 18 Manchester Regiment. "Mary had a little watch, She swallowed it one day, and now she's taking Bachen's pills to drive the time away. Well, are they Beechams? Oh, good, we know Beecham, thank you. Okay. Margaret was obviously nursing at Kitchener for a while. On the 9th of October 1916, she renewed her contract. Okay, and there is her signature. And just note who her witness is, L. Davies, one of the nurses who was nursing with her at Brighton, at Kitchener Hospital. And obviously what happened was the nurses signed up again with the QAs, they renewed their contract, and it seems as though they wanted a bit of adventure, and so they were sent off to Salonika. They went on the Britannia, and she went with her nursing friends, the Britannic. And this Britannic was the sister ship to the Olympic and the Titanic. Here is Margaret, and here are Australian nurses also going out to Salonika, not on the Britannic, but on the Illawarra. They met the same fate as those who the next month were on the Britannic. Because on the 21st of November of this very same year, the Britannic was on its way to pick up wounded soldiers. It was damaged by an underwater mine off the Greek island of Kea. It sank 55 minutes later. There were 1,065 people on board. Most were rescued from water and lifeboats, but 30 were drowned, who included the nurses. And the wreck was found, oh, I thought I had a photograph of the wreck, by Jacques Cousteau in 1976. Now, Margaret is off to Siberia, and as you all know, Serbia, I'm sorry. And as you all know, Salonika is somewhere down here, Hungary is here, and we've got those dreadful Austrians rampaging in here. We've got the dreadful Bulgarians rampaging in here. And so what do you do if you are a sensible Serbian? You run away into Albania and you get to Greece. And here is the area. This is the border now between Serbia and Greece. The Bulgarians, the Austrians, and you might remember there was a cartoon involving King Ferdinand of Bulgaria being very despondent because of the fall of Monastir. Well, now Monastir is where there was a lot of fighting. As you can see, it's in Macedonia. As you will see, it's the end of the railway line. Margaret's hospital is here, and this was the main scene of much of the fighting. The British tended to fight over here, and there were a lot, the French were mainly here and the British were mainly here. Now, this is the only map that I have been able to find in my hunting that shows us exactly where Margaret was stationed. And the reason is twofold. Sometimes they use Cyrillic script, and secondly, I don't speak Serbian or Macedonian or Greek, and thirdly, they have changed all the names of everywhere. But here is Salonika. And from Salonika, we have a railway line, and it goes along and along and along, and it goes to Monastir. So we sort of know where we are, okay. And because the front line was about here and the front line was over there, obviously the hospitals were there. And going along from Salonika along the railway line, we get to a place called Vertikop. And Vertikop is where Margaret's hospital was to be found. Now, this is just to show you what the country was like at the time. So this shows you a hospital out in the Bundu, but indicating that it is a hospital. Here's a painting by a well-known soldier, I've forgotten his name unfortunately, of the countryside. Another hospital, again, you can see, and this becomes important, the Red Cross, but you can see it's all tented. There is nothing left today. It is very difficult to find anything. Patients, nurse, hospital. A smaller hospital, and you can see, in fact, this is a Scottish women's hospital, and you can see the ambulances. An Australian hospital. Imagine trying to perform surgery and to nurse in fly-ridden hospitals like this. Look at the roads. This is the New Zealand hospital at Salonika, or fairly close to Salonika, a large hospital. Nurses with doctors, with patients. They treated a lot of outpatients. Patients with the tents up. Nurses, you can see their QAs. A hospital in a place unpronounceable. This is actually, I find quite interesting. This is a doctor, and her name is Dr. Catherine Stewart MacPhail. And it's interesting that she's dancing with her patients. It would never have been allowed of the QAs, but she was a Scottish women's hospital doctor. They made their own rules and regulations. So this is obviously a social event, and there Dr. MacPhail is dancing. The nurses playing hockey. And when one thinks about it, they were so incredibly young and adventurous. I mean, and energetic. Here are two of quite senior nurses, and you can see they are cleaning their shoes because of the mud. They wear their boots, but on this particular day, they're cleaning. Pop in, the one looks quite cheerful, the other a bit gloomy. Nurses out for a walk, so life had some fun. Australians. There was a lot of malaria. So here the nurses are, and this is what they wore to protect them. And more soldiers were struck down by malaria than anything else. Now, we've seen, here's Vertikop, and we've seen hospitals scattered all over. At Ostrovo was one of the Scottish Women's Hospital. There were actually two hospitals at Vertikop, etc. But now, if you think of this as more or less the border, on the other side of the border, here is Lake Dorian. And just north of Lake Dorian was a place then called Hudoa. Okay? I suspect that it is now the Stromnitz station. And I've been working with the Salonika War Society, and everybody's trying to find Hudoa. Now, what was at Hudoa? At Hudoa, there was also a hospital, quite a large hospital, and it was staffed by Germans. No, I've gone wrong. I'm sorry. No. Okay. All right, I've missed something, but anyway, if you can forgive me for one moment, and I will find what my problem is. Okay, well, there's no train smash, so we just carry on and see what happens. Okay. Oh, no, we don't. We don't. Sorry, let's just do this. This is so that you can be tested afterwards. It's called revision. I don't know how to speed it up, so I just do the best I can. You know, I discovered when I became a judge that my job was to go backwards in time. And I started reading judgments written in 1898 and 1899. You know, and I realized we go back many centuries. Okay. All right, so we have everybody in the area. Okay, this is actually not the German hospital. I apologize. This is not Hudoa. I don't know why I've put the map in here. It put me off my stride. But anyway, we're back to our hospitals, and I suspect that, yes, this is actually our hospital. We've got hospital number 36 and hospital number 37 at Vertikop. There are 2 hospitals, and they are very close to each other, okay? Hard to distinguish between them, but they are very close, and you can see, again, the Red Cross, okay? There we are with the entrance to the hospital, the flag, patients at this particular hospital, and here we've got, over in the distance, is Vertikop itself. And this is actually where today, if you were to wander around, you'd find any relics of the hospital, if there were such. The hospital was on a railway station. This was the railway station in those days, and it was actually called Skydra or Vertikop Station. This is the station today, and now you see why I have difficulty in tracing things. So that is the railway station today. Again, the hospital from the station. Loading ammunition at the station and guarding the ammunition at the station. There was an aeroplane, a French aerodrome at Vertikop, because this was in the French area. And here was the dead aeroplanes hospital and the bits and pieces that they used to fix up the aeroplanes. So here is Vertikop on a railway line with an aerodrome, with a French squadron of planes. And obviously the squadron of planes was used in the Battle of Monastir and was used to attack the Austrians and was used to attack the Bulgarians. Now, over those mountains, as I said to you, is Hudoa. And this is a Bulgarian-German hospital over here. And here is nurse Edith Rusch. She was Krankenschwester Edith Rusch. She was a nurse who, like many others, kept a diary. And as a result, if we spoke German and could read it, we would know about some of the activities there. This is her ID book and her Ausweis. And life at Hudoa and the hospital there was very like life for the British in their hospitals. Here they are all lining up, the nurses and the orderlies and perhaps doctors. Here are the nurses. Here is obviously a group of nurses, doctors, officers. Here are nurses with children. And here is nurse Edith Rusch's War Medal. It is the Medal of Honor of the Prussian Red Cross 3rd Class. The writing on one side says for service to the Red Cross, and on the reverse says WRAV, which stands for Wilhelm II, and he is King of the Germans, Emperor of the Germans and King of Prussia. And here she is with the pilots of the plane, and here is one of the Gotha bombers. Now, there were 25 Gotha G3 aircraft which were produced in total, and they were sent to Kagol 1 and Kagol 3, which were the squadrons operating in the Balkans out of Hudoa. Their combat service was limited but very effective, and in 1916 they destroyed a railway bridge over the Danube in Romania. And you've seen, I think, this picture before, or no, you're going to see it again. These are the bombs that the Gothas could drop. Some quite big ones and some quite little ones. And here is one, this is Kagol 3. And in the first months of 1917, their air missions intensified. On the 27th of February, they went as far as Thessalonica, and they bombed there. They bombed warehouses. And in April, they bombed Monastir, and in April, they bombed Edessa. But we're interested in the events of the 12th of March. On the 12th of March, they flew from Hyodoa, north of Lake Doiron, so it's about here, and they went to Vertikop. They bombed the English hospital at Vertikop, also sometimes known in the reports as Mavrononi. 2 nurses were killed, Mary Marshall and Margaret Dewar. Margaret was at this hospital, number 37 General. Now, when this happened, remember I told you about the propaganda involving Serbia? Well, much was made of it by the Serbian government in exile. So they appointed Dr. Rudolf Reis. On the one hand, he was German, so that was very good. He had obtained a PhD in chemistry from the University of Lausanne, and he was a professor of forensic science. So he was seen as quite a neutral person. And he was commissioned by the Serbian government to investigate atrocities. And he did a number of investigations for the Serbian government, and they were called Austro-Hungarian atrocities. As a supposed neutral, his reports were used for propaganda value, and they had considerable impact. These reports were written in English, not in German or Serbian, because they were clearly for international consumption, particularly US consumption. And they had great impact. I mean, this photograph just happens to have the Austrian soldiers walking off. So obviously, people felt very compelled to accept that there had been Hungarian atrocities. So, because of this bombing of the hospital, he was again commissioned to write an expert report on the bombardment of British Hospital number 37 by enemy aeroplanes. And he went to Vertikop and he conducted an expert inquiry, and it was very quickly done. So he had a look at the destruction of the ammunition dump, and here are some French officers having a look at the same destruction. He looked at the hospital, and he discovered that 2 English nurses and 4 hospital orderlies were killed, and that at the time of the bombardment, a train was passing on the line east of the hospital. So that, of course, might have suggested that the bombing was of the train. Here we've got the train going through. And he says the first bomb fell 2 yards in front of the operating theatre, and it killed 1 nurse and 1 orderly. But he said the distance from the railway line is about 200 yards. A second bomb fell in an X-ray tent. A third bomb struck the road. 4th and 5th bomb fell beside a hospital tent, which was empty. Then he says the 6th bomb, this is the operating theatre. And he said the 6th bomb entered the tent, and it is this bomb that killed Margaret Dewar. He concluded that the bombs were all released simultaneously. They fell on the hospital, and he said he went up in an aeroplane belonging to the Vertikop squadron, and they flew over the bombed hospitals at a height of 3,000 meters. And he says, although there was a slight haze, the 12 red crosses were perfectly visible to the naked eye. He then concluded that the visibility must have been much greater on the day of the bombing, because it was a bright day and nobody could have been under any illusions that these were hospitals with red crosses. He says the railway line was not the target, because the aviators knew that they were above hospitals, and if they'd wanted to attack a train, his report says, well, they could have waited until the train had quitted the zone of the hospitals. He decided that the aviators wanted to hit the hospital. He said the nature of the bombs, the dropping of a series of bombs close to one another, there was no error in marksmanship. The bombs were in the middle of the hospital. The airmen must have seen where their trial bomb fell, and then they dropped 6 further bombs on the hospital. So that was his report of the 22nd of March. Margaret was in the ward. The bombing happened. She apparently ran inside and she placed herself on a bed on top of a patient. The military conducted an investigation, and the inquest into her death said that she was hit in the back and the head, and she died very quickly. Now, Rather interestingly, on the 16th of March, 4 days after she was killed, some of her friends wrote to Mrs. Dewar. They told her that they'd been at Brighton together for 6 months. They'd come out to Salonika on the Britannic. They'd spent, quote, many happy days together. And the letter gives an idea of what these nurses would have liked to have been written to their families about themselves. Sympathies, the way of death, that death was without suffering, that she was not alone when she died, that she was loved, and that she received a proper burial. The end of the letter, you remember the witness to her contract is Nurse Davies, and Bertha Mackay and Ella Margaret Keats, and I haven't been able yet to research them. But in true nursing style, they talk about her as Dewar, and I know my mother always talked about her friends by their surnames. All right, now what does the letter say? I'll just read some quotes. Dear Mrs. Dewar, we feel that although strangers to you, we cannot let the time pass without offering to you our very deep and sincere sympathy in your great loss, and telling you how proud we all here of the noble way in which Sister Dewar met her death. Fully aware of the dangers, she ran, and thoughtless of herself, she ran to the help of one of her patients, and in securing his safety was struck herself, while the man escaped untouched solely due to her self-sacrifice. I'm sure it will be a great consolation to you to know that she did not suffer at all, as it was quite instantaneous. She just grasped the hand of a sister who was with her when she was struck, and all was over. She'd been down to Salonika about a fortnight ago for a week's leave and had a very happy time and was very well and happy. 5 minutes before the raid, she was in our tent, talking and laughing in her own bright way. Now, we don't have photographs of Margaret's funeral, but this is a series of pictures of another nurse, Margaret Lowe, and the photographs and the pictures of her funeral. And the letter goes on to say how the other nurse and the orderlies who were killed have been buried together in a little Serbian cemetery. The two sisters in the cemetery with the men on either side, although away from everywhere, wildflowers were gathered and wreaths were strewn about. The Serbian patients made a wreath and wrote on it, "Flowers may fade, but the courage and devotion of the English sisters will remain forever in the hearts of the Serbian soldiers." As we all stood around the grave, a French aeroplane flew over and dropped violence on the victims of the aeroplanes of another nation. While the British are here, write the nurses, their last resting place shall be well looked after. They had a full military funeral, and all was done in all ways that was possible, and they died honoured and respected of men of all nations who form our great Entente. I would like to impress upon you that Sister Dewar was very well and happy to the last moments and was laughing at the danger as she went to her last patient's bed. There is a little wooden cross that marks her resting place. We will photograph it and send it to you. And Melanie has the original photograph if anybody would like to see it. Now, the nurse whose hand Margaret held was Annie Rebecca Calhoun. She joined the QA in June 1916. She was serving at the same hospital as Margaret. She was herself wounded, but nevertheless she cradled Margaret in her arms as she was dying. And Sister Calhoun was awarded the military medal the following year. Margaret did not receive the medal because it is not awarded posthumously. The citation to the medal reads, "For conspicuous bravery and devotion to duty during an enemy air raid." She was assisting Staff Nurse Dewar when the latter was fatally wounded. And although the tent was full of smoke and acrid fumes, and she'd been struck by a fragment of a bomb herself, she attended to Staff Nurse Dewar and also to the case of a helpless patient. Well, the military now had to pack everything up of Margaret's, and there are these endless lists. Just some of them. They were divided into packages. The first package, there was a nurse's ruff, 5 silver teaspoons, a hypodermic, a miniature mandolin, 1 stuffed dress and 1 cotton dress, 5 uniform caps, 9 aprons, 3 coveralls, a night dress and pajamas, and 1 pair of riding breeches. and a pair of side combs. In the second package, inter alia, was a blue scarf, a bottle of skin cream, 3 books, a hairbrush, more aprons, collars and cuffs, and 12.5 pairs of stockings. In the third package were letters and books. Package 4, there were 2 Macintosh coats and a rug and a cushion, and the last package had a camp bed, a ground sheet, and a washstand. And so the list was done. And the British Army wrote to Mrs. Dewar saying that the War Department have £15, 18 shillings and 8 pence due to Margaret's estate from Army funds. They then wrote and said, actually, there's also another £1 and 15 shillings being a share of the messing allowance from Kitchener's Hospital. And then Mrs. Dewar wrote back asking for her daughter's death certificate and the boxes of her things. And have a look at this portion of the letter that's been marked in red.